Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Mallory Stewart, CEO here at the Council on Strategic Risks. In case any of you are new to us, the Council is a nonprofit, nonpartisan security policy institute devoted to anticipating, analyzing, and addressing core systemic risks to security in the 21st century. We work on the issues affecting the strategic arena on all levels, including the effects of climate change, the impacts of emerging technologies, and the resurgence of nuclear threats, not far from our minds as the Iran war enters its sixth month. And today we are honored to bring a magnifying glass to one aspect of the war, which has become a more urgent strategic question as the conflict drags on: the seemingly limited capability of military strikes to eliminate Iran's nuclear program. And I'm really looking forward to moderating this discussion with our two amazing experts, the Honorable Rose Gottemoeller and the Honorable Andy Weber. Even though they are well known, I just want to give a very brief bio for both of them. Rose Gottemoeller is presently a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. She also serves as lecturer at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and its Center for International Security and Cooperation. Before joining Stanford, Rose was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2016 to 2019. And prior to NATO, she served for nearly 5 years as the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the U.S. Department of State. There, she advised the Secretary of State on arms control, nonproliferation, and political military affairs. Before that, when she was Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Rose was the chief U.S. negotiator of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, New START, with the Russian Federation. Rose is also a deeply valued member of CSR's Board of Advisors. Andy Weber's decades of U.S. government service includes 5.5 years as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs. He was a driving force behind the non-nuclear cooperative threat reduction efforts to remove weapons-grade uranium from Kazakhstan and Georgia, to remove nuclear-capable MiG-29 aircraft from Moldova, to reduce biological weapons threats globally, and to destroy Libyan and Syrian chemical weapons stockpiles. In addition, he coordinated U.S. leadership of the international Ebola response for the Department of State. Most importantly, for the Council on Strategic Risks, Andy is a senior fellow at CSR's Jan E. Nolan Center on Strategic Weapons. Thank you both for joining us today. Today, I will just start with some very brief background and then ask our guests several questions. After that, we will open up to written questions from all of you in the audience. So please put your questions in the chat. 6 months since the U.S. initially bombed Iran and following the unceremonious end of the 60-day MOU between the U.S. and Iran, the Iran nuclear program and the military activities in the Strait of Hormuz remain intimately connected. Iran is trying to use its ability to disrupt the Strait of Hormuz as leverage for sanctions relief, to end U.S. control of the strait, and to limit further U.S. attacks. Washington is trying to use a blockade and military pressure to obtain nuclear program restrictions and access to the uranium stockpile, as well as to guarantee that Iran will not be able to control the strait itself going forward. The United States has superior conventional forces and, it seems, can force some traffic through the waterway, but Iran needs only intermittent attacks and mining threats to seed general uncertainty. This results in disproportionate economic risks for shippers and continues to dissuade passage. This conflagration leads to a paradox. Military action has probably reduced Iran's large-scale enrichment capacity, but it has also reduced international visibility and oversight of its nuclear program. Additionally, military action almost certainly strengthens Iran's incentive to retain and further develop its nuclear weapons capacity. At the same time, Iran's resistance to U.S. demands in the strait seems to strengthen President Trump's conviction that Iran's nuclear program has to be eradicated. The imminent risks are more fatal attacks, including on third parties, and a growing global economic crisis. And there is no realistic way to prevent Tehran from continuing to develop its nuclear weapons capacity. A restoration of IAEA access and a verified accounting of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile would be the single most important nuclear risk reduction development, but is that even possible at this point? To discuss this and many other questions, we are so lucky to have two of the most knowledgeable people I know on the issue of nuclear verification with us today. I was hoping to start with a question for Andy, and then we'll move over to questions for Rose. So Andy, first question for you. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, negotiated under President Obama, provided oversight and restraint for certain aspects of the Iranian nuclear program. President Trump pulled out of the JCPOA during his first term. But can you discuss a bit where we were under the JCPOA with respect to knowledge and oversight of the Iranian program, what might be possible to reinvigorate, if anything, and what is perhaps impossible to redo at this point?
Sure. I mean, we were in a much better place than we are now. The result of President Trump pulling out of that agreement in 2018 in order to negotiate a better deal, which we're still waiting for, was that Iran ramped up its production of highly enriched uranium. Under the JCPOA, 97% of the low enriched uranium was removed from Iran through Kazakhstan to Russia, and they had zero highly enriched uranium. Today they have over 400 kilograms, enough for nearly a dozen nuclear bombs worth of HEU. So it's a much worse situation than we're in. And then the inspection regime under JCPOA was the most intrusive set of inspections under the IAEA in history. So we had good access. We had remote access as well as physical access by inspectors, the ability to do surprise inspections. Iran is a member of the additional protocol, so not just at the known sites. The situation today is much, much worse than it was under the JCPOA.
And do you think it would be possible to get back to any of those arenas in which we had some good oversight, or now that we've lost access and continuing monitoring capacity, would we even be able to get back to where we were under the JCPOA?
Well, it would be extremely difficult, and we've seen how the negotiations on this issue have floundered, how it keeps getting delayed. The parties chose to focus on reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and even that is seems impossible at this stage. So I think what we're going to have to do in order to deal with this very large amount of HEU that remains mostly at a site called near the city of Isfahan. It's in tunnels that were bombed in June of 2025 as part of Operation Midnight Hammer. I will say that the Midnight Hammer operation did seriously degrade Iran's enrichment capacity by taking out the underground facilities at Natanz and Fordo. But I think today, and I have been outspoken that there really is no good military operation that would require ground forces in the middle of Iran for an extended period of time to essentially do a mining operation to recover the HEU, which is in the form of uranium hexafluoride gas in these gas tanks. Think about large scuba tanks, and we don't know the condition of them. It would be extremely risky, and I'm pleased that the administration has not decided to send special forces into Iran for that mission. But I think at this point, the best hope we have of solving the nuclear issue is to internationalize it, to get the IAEA. Remember, the JCPOA involved multiple parties, including the European Union, Russia, and the IAEA obviously had a leading role in that. One point, and I've lately been pressing for this, that is not very well known, but in 2016, the IAEA established an international low enriched uranium fuel bank in Uskhamen, Kazakhstan. And indeed, that facility was purpose built for this type of situation. So to me, the best solution, and I know that the government of Kazakhstan has proposed this and offered its assistance in coordination with Rafael Grossi at the IAEA, to have an international team go in and methodically, safely recover the HEU, prepare it for safe transport, and remove it to Kazakhstan, where it could be blended down to low enriched uranium. That seems to me to be, an elegant solution to a very, very thorny problem that probably will not be solved bilaterally.
Thank you. I think we need to discuss that a little bit more because there's a lot of interesting details there. But speaking of HEU removal and also Kazakhstan, in 1994, you were involved in an effort, a secret operation called Project Sapphire, to remove HEU from Kazakhstan. Can you discuss that a little bit and tell us maybe how some of those lessons really could play out in the Iran situation?
Yes, and Rose was on the NSC staff at that time and was very involved. Project Sapphire, which started out as a slightly murky, black markety approach by a factory director to me when I was serving at the U.S. Embassy in Almaty, Kazakhstan in 1993, eventually became a secret bilateral operation between our two governments, between Kazakhstan and the United States. And it was a huge undertaking. I mean, we had a team of over 30 people working, you know, 12, 14-hour shifts packaging the material. And the packaging operation took almost 6 weeks. We had to fly in special canisters for the safe transport of highly enriched uranium. And we successfully removed to the United States, where it was blended down via C-5 Galaxy transport aircraft, 600 kilograms of 90% enriched, highly enriched uranium, which is much more than, about double of what the Iranians currently possess. But it was very complicated. It was done cooperatively. It was based on trust that had been built between our governments and on the ground with the factory director and his team. They worked side by side with our technical experts in the packaging operation.
Thank you. I think that's really important precedent and knowledge. Have you seen sort of any discussion going forward right now with respect to how we could do that kind of operation in Iran, or has it just been sort of radio silence from this administration?
Well, I know that Kazakhstan, in coordination with the IAEA, has proposed this type of solution. It would require, of course, full Iranian cooperation. I think they're much more likely to agree to have the material removed to Kazakhstan, essentially to an IAEA fuel bank, so a neutral third party, rather than giving it up to the United States. But failure to resolve the HEU stockpile sitting in Iran would unfortunately mean that we've failed in achieving the main objective of this war, which is the denuclearization of Iran.
Yeah, well, that's something that we need to continue to discuss how we address that. I was hoping to go over to Rose on the issue of conversion of HEU to LEU. You've played a significantly important and supporting role in this conversion in the past. Can you talk a bit about the possible relevance and significance of the megatons to megawatts program that you engaged in with Russia?
Well, certainly, Mallory, and it will be to pick up on some points that Andy has made. First of all, I do agree, like the JCPOA to begin with, this effort should be an international one. And I really like Andy's idea of engaging the Kazakhstanis who've been very responsible about investing in this international fuel bank and working with the IAEA to get it up and running. It's safeguarded. It's really I think, excellent example of international cooperation on nonproliferation goals. So it's a worthy site to think about as a resting place for the Iranian enriched uranium. But one of the points I wanted to start out with was just to talk about the complexity that's involved in making these big nuclear deals work. And I'm not just talking about an arms control treaty. You just mentioned the HEU purchase agreement. I'll come back to that in a moment. But Project Sapphire itself, Andy was intensively engaged on the ground with a very large interagency team there, including Department of Defense. He mentioned the Department of Defense transport planes that were used. But back in Washington, I was in charge of the Tiger team that was working all the parts and pieces of what to do to handle this enriched material coming out of Kazakhstan back in 1994. And if you can believe it, at the time, we had lots of domestic political issues to engage with also. Vice President Gore calling up the then governor of Tennessee to ask if we could bring the material to Tennessee to be downblended. And so there were domestic political issues to resolve. And the point is, it involved the highest levels of our government, the president and vice president, as well as the entire interagency in Washington, as well as a very well integrated interagency team on the ground in Kazakhstan, which Andy was leading. So I have to say, what worries me about the current moment is that we see none of this intense discussion and intense consideration of all the moving parts that will have to be addressed in order to handle this problem of the highly enriched uranium in Iran. It's at the diplomatic level and it's at the technical level. Andy mentioned the necessity of developing joint confidence. That is very, very important. And the importance of developing joint confidence is because it's a team building effort. It's a team building effort that allows our government experts and some of our experts from the national laboratories, for example, to interact in practical and problem solving ways pragmatically with the Iranians, for example, or in the case of Kazakhstan, it was with the Kazakhstani experts and government, but also with the Russians, who at the time were not quite sure whether they would give up ownership of that material that happened to be residing in Kazakhstan. So we had to make a case to them as well. So international efforts from the top down, very well integrated, pragmatic problem solving at all levels with a great deal of engagement and involvement of experts. So, in order to illustrate this for one moment, I did want to talk because we've done some of this before. Sapphire was a great example, but also you mentioned the HEU purchase agreement. And the other thing I wanted to say is that it takes time to make these things happen. The HEU purchase agreement, some of the founding documents were signed in 1992 and 1993, but it wasn't fully off the ground for another 10 years. And certainly the kind of measures we had to work out in order to get the U.S. Commercial entities meshed up with the Russian side were extraordinary and took a great deal of negotiation. But I just pulled up this morning, for those of you not familiar with the so-called HEU deal, I wanted to reference a briefing that was done by William Wanderer, and you can find it on the DOE website. It was from May of 2014, but it's a really good rundown of the HEU highly enriched uranium purchase agreement. And it talks about all the parts and pieces, the moving parts of pieces involving commercial entities on the US side and on the Russian side, as well as, of course, the national laboratories and government entities. But for those of you not familiar with it, starting with the 1993 HU purchase agreement, the United States basically purchased 500 metric tons of Russian origin highly enriched uranium. And this was downblended then to low enriched uranium to be fabricated into power plant fuel for U.S. nuclear power plants. These 500 metric tons of 90% HEU came out of Soviet era nuclear warheads, and it led to the permanent elimination of approximately 20,000 Soviet era nuclear warheads. It's interesting that from 20, I'm sorry, from basically in the first 15 years of this century, about 10% of US electricity was generated by these former Soviet warheads that were being burned up as LEU in US nuclear power plants. And so it was a great non-proliferation project. I only say that because people have forgotten about the HEU deal. I think it's an absolutely great example of a practical non-proliferation project, but also, again, all the moving parts and pieces that involve commercial, government, technical, national laboratories on both sides in Russia and the United States, and worked. But it took a long time. It took a great deal of effort, and many experts from across Russia and the United States, including those who, during the implementation of the HEU deal, were present at Russian enrichment facilities to ensure that the nuclear weapons material was actually the material that was being downblended, and that it was the material that was being sent to the United States to fabricate as low enriched uranium into nuclear power plant fuel. At the time, we didn't want the Russians simply producing new HEU, stockpiling the warheads, producing new HEU, and sending that to us instead. So it was a very intensive and intrusive also verification monitoring regime that had the effect, I think, over time of really binding the two expert communities together. The last thing I'll say in this regard, Mallory, is that I do think it was important because it produced for us a cadre of experts on the US side as well as on the Russian side who would be capable of working in this arena together. Now, there is a problem at the moment, and that is Russia has been an aggressor in Ukraine. There is a war raging in Ukraine, which is an unjust war and one we are very opposed to. I just say this in order to convey that it is possible to develop this kind of cooperation internationally, the very kind that Andy is talking about. I'm confident that there are experts in Kazakhstan who would be willing to work with us. And also there are, I think, experts around the world, including in the IAEA community, who would be willing to work with us, the IAEA having had already a huge amount of experience working in Iran, thanks to the JCPOA and its implementation. So I just wanted to make this point that we cannot carry out this kind of project with a kind of, as I call it, drive-by diplomacy, where someone goes off and does a negotiation for a couple of days and walks away. It is a huge effort that has to be carried out by a full team of experts and involving the highest level of government, as well as out, in this case, I think also out into the community in some of the commercial spaces as well. And we would have to figure out what would make the most sense in that regard. But I'm not sure today that we would want to depend so heavily on the Department of Defense, for example, for transport services. Maybe this is something we would contract for commercially. So we'd have to leave an open mind to a commercial engagement. But I really wanted to emphasize that point. This cannot be done with just one layer and one level of brief interaction. It's a lot of effort, a lot of people, and a lot of expertise involved.
Thank you so much, Rose. It's such a good example to talk about. I mean, I think whether Project Sapphire or the HEU purchase agreement or the JCPOA itself, the US government never started with immediate, strong, and demanding negotiating stances, or those were not successful if they did. I think it would be useful to talk a little bit more about sort of the confidence building or relationship building in some of those previous contexts that was necessary, in addition to the interagency and international efforts that were really built to support these successful agreements. In this context, we have negotiating happening during military conflict and ongoing bombing. And really the juxtaposition of those three examples, Project Sapphire, HEU Purchase Agreement, and JCPOA, against a negotiating stance that's happening during bombing with very few players, no international or interagency involvement, really seems to make this particular Iran negotiation discussion much more complicated and potentially less effective. Is that something that you've seen firsthand?
Well, I would say I think that's very, very fair. This is a circumstance. It was difficult in the 1990s. The Soviet Union had just fallen apart. There was a chaotic situation in many places across the former USSR. As I said, the Russians were unsure at the time who had ownership of the material that happened to reside in Kazakhstan. The Kazakhs very insistent that they had ownership of it. So there were all kinds of issues to be dealt with. But at that time, there was not, thank God, a shooting war going on between the various republics of the former USSR. And that was, I think, from that perspective, a much easier transition than it might have been. Sadly, today we see this war between Russia and Ukraine that Russia instigated. And so we do have to treat that as the reality of the moment. And we have a shooting war going on in the Middle East with the United States and Israel pressing Iran. So how to think about it at this moment, I tell you, I'll be eager to hear Andy's opinion of this too. I would start in two ways. First of all, I would lean on Rafael Grossi and the IAEA, who still, I think, have a store of confidence among the Iranians and would be able to perhaps at least serve as initial messengers to begin talking about some of these ideas that Andy has been suggesting. And I would also see if early on Kazakhstan could come to play a role and be willing to engage. They generally are very cautious in engaging, although they're big supporters of non-proliferation regimes overall. And their president, President Tokayev, is an experienced diplomat and has had many years working also as Minister of Foreign Affairs. So I could see the Kazakhstanis being effective in communicating with the Iranians and talking about the goals and objectives. Now, here's a thought that I think is also one worth considering, whether or not Beijing would be willing to participate at this moment. But don't forget, it was such a strange, now sitting from where we are today with our geopolitical competition, the JCPOA was not only Russia, EU, Iran, and the United States, China was very involved in it as well, and was very willing to be at the table and to help to facilitate some of the solutions in the JCPOA negotiations. So perhaps, I don't think as a first order of business, I certainly wouldn't send in the U.S. Special Forces. I never saw any reason for that except further chaos, as well as, sadly, there would be a lot of death and destruction out of such an approach. But an approach that would make use of some trusted interlocutors to begin with, and then perhaps to expand sooner rather than later to an expert level involving the United States and those who are very experienced in addressing and dealing with these kinds of international nuclear material problems. And we have many experts both in our national laboratories, but also in the commercial sector as well.
Yeah, a quick question over to Andy, and then I'm going to open it up for the questions we receive from the audience. But Andy, how do you think it would make sense to go about beginning the sort of addressing the movement of this highly enriched uranium, enough, as you say, to make almost a dozen nuclear weapons in Iran? Is it starting with the international effort? Is it starting with ceasing military operations? What do you think should be the first step for this administration?
Well, I think it has to be at a few different levels. In all these operations over the years, whether it's removing, and Mallory, you were very involved in removing chemical weapons, as was Rose, from Syria for destruction. it's very important to have the highest level of the governments sort of to give top cover, but it's working with the custodians, the people who either created these materials and understood them, understood the safety issues. In the case of the Iranian HEU, the people who know where it's located. We have to have that on the ground trust building. I look back on Sapphire, and we had a secret meeting in Blair House during President Nazarbayev's, the first president's visit to Washington to meet with Bill Clinton, where we got his approval uh, to do an inventory, an initial inspection of the Ulba plant where we, believed this material was, but in order to verify that. But also there was a lot of time and I sacrificed pieces of my liver just bonding with the factory director who helped, run the operation on the ground. We went on moose hunting trips. We downed in one sitting a bottle of wild turkey, which I can't imagine doing today. But building that trust, as Rose said, by solving practical issues together, that's where we need to be. And I think the IAEA, President Tokayev, um, perhaps the PRC leadership, uh, President Putin could all help solve this problem, because certainly the P5 um, nuclear weapon states have no interest in Iran developing a nuclear weapon.
Thank you, Andy and Rose, so much. I think I'm going to turn to some questions that we've received. First one from Michael Walker, that there are potentially many U.S. adversaries who would like negotiations and or military action to fail and the U.S. to be stuck in an endless quagmire again. Other nations may be unsupportive or uncooperative or seek to sabotage negotiation efforts. How do you think we can sort of address this hurdle, or can this hurdle be overcome, knowing that there are countries out there that want this to be another endless war?
We've been talking about it already this morning, Mallory, but I would say, I guess the big elephant in the room here is Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation. That country, and indeed that president, was so central to the important progress that we made in this century, because don't forget, Vladimir Putin has been president of the Russian Federation since January of 2000. Well, we had a few off years then with Dmitry Medvedev, but essentially Putin has been the leader of the country for the bulk of this century. And so a lot of the progress that was made in the HEU purchase agreement, in the in the JCPOA, was made under Putin's time in office. So it's chancy, I know, and there's an enormous amount of resentment that he holds personally and that the Kremlin holds at the moment, the top Russian elite and leadership. But I think, if we get to a point before too long where we are considering what might be done again to tackle weapons of mass destruction problems with Russia. And I believe that we should be able to continue to oppose them and their war in Ukraine while working together on existential threats like nuclear threats, weapons of mass destruction threats. Perhaps there is a way to appeal to that history and to say, let's figure out a way quietly to work together on trying to solve this problem with Iran. And when I say quietly, I don't mean to hide it from the public, to hide it from the media, but to not be engaging in megaphone diplomacy, to not be constantly hunting for the headlines, but instead to be just quietly, pragmatically, again, getting the experts together to figure out how to solve this problem. If the answer is to move it to Kazakhstan and the fuel bank, how are we going to do that? And who's going to be engaged, and who's going to be best in working with the Iranians to make it happen? And that requires, I would say, a restoration of trust and confidence between Moscow and Washington. It's not there in the way it was during the time we were implementing the JCPOA even 10 years ago. But I do know that there are still many, many people on both sides who work together closely. And so there is, I believe, a kind of reservoir still of mutual understanding and mutual confidence. Again, it's not. I want to make sure people understand this is not all about. It's important, as Andy said, to be able to sit and have a good drink of whiskey with somebody and hear about his kids and hear about his dacha. You won't be drinking whiskey with the Iranians, at least I don't think so. But anyway, when I say to have a reservoir of trust and confidence, it's built first of all from huge professional respect for mutual expertise. That's the first line. And then after that, if there's a way to have a good personal relationship because you talk about each other's grandkids, that is great. That bolsters the mutual confidence that builds up once the two parties understand that they have the technical chops to handle a problem.
I think that makes good sense. I mean, these kind of relationship building are elements of achieving greater confidence between negotiators and discussions. I mean, I think one of the questions we've seen come in, and one of the questions raised in this discussion is whether it's feasible to think that Iran could continue enrichment or reprocessing or worse while under siege, and whether it's possible that much of the HEU or any of the HEU could have been eliminated by the bombings. And specifically, I guess, to Rose, did we ever continue eliminating Russian HEU any other way than downblending? Was there a discussion of potentially different mechanisms to give ourselves confidence that this HEU would be destroyed? Because right now we face a very open-ended question.
Well, it was Tom Neff at MIT who originally came up with this idea. I think it was a huge flash of inspiration that he published in a New York Times op-ed back in 1991. So the idea really grabbed hold quickly, and people were very impressed and I think taken with it. Again, how to implement it was very complex and difficult and took a long time to figure out. But the basic concept was well understood. That was to take highly enriched uranium out of warheads that the Russians wanted to eliminate and turn it into value for them because they were on their backs at the time economically, huge economic crisis in Russia. And so they were looking for ways to earn some money, and this was seen as a ready way to do so. And it turned out to be very mutually beneficial, both for U.S. nuclear power, but also for the Russian Federation's bottom line. That said, toward the end of the HEU deal, 2012, 2013, the United States was trying to push the notion of an HEU 2 deal, where a kind of second phase would proceed with this effort to eliminate further Russian warheads by this mechanism. And at the time, the Russians said no, they wanted to move on to the commercial market and basically deal with us on the commercial market if we wanted more enriched uranium from them. So that is where things stood, but there was no other idea tried out that I recollect for dealing with that enriched uranium.
It's helpful. I mean, I think we've seen also the economic consequences of this conflict extending globally. And so, to the question of what we do with other countries either not being supportive of a resolution or supportive of negotiations, it seems like the economic effects are going to be global at some point so significantly that it won't be in any potential US adversary interest to continue this. But that may be wrong. And I guess question to you, Andy, is how is the US government able to loop in the international community on this when there's so much conflicting interactions with the international community on this particular challenge right now? Is there any particular sort of access point, maybe in the Kazakhstan government or in the US government, that could start to expand out the Iran challenge to a global set of negotiators versus keeping it sort of internal?
Yeah, I think Rafael Grossi, who's now a candidate for Secretary General of the United Nations, could play, and he has been playing a behind the scenes role, but he could play a more active role. It's a question of timing. And I agree, we could have even track two working groups on the practical challenges, how we would do this, what would be required, what the overpacks would look like, how it would be moved. We did this in 2013 with the Russian Federation, focused on the challenge of Syria's chemical weapons. We didn't have any political agreement. We didn't know if Syria would ever agree to give them up, but we had technical level talks about the how. How would we do it? How would we ensure safety? What would the oversight, in this case, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, technical secretariat was able to oversee those operations that eventually did happen after the United States and the United Kingdom threatened military force. So I think the time to start is now, whether it's, track 1.5 or track 2 discussions at the technical level, to work out the modalities, to understand what technologies we would need to do this. And this is where a party that has good relations with all of the actors and Kazakhstan really fits that bill. President Tokayev has worked in the United Nations. He was foreign minister. Actually, he was foreign minister during Project Sapphire. And Pakistan apparently has been playing an important role in mediating. So I do think what has to happen, we can't just have, J.D. Vance talking to his counterpart. We have to have that next layer of discussions, even if it's just sort of the hypothetical about how we would do it if we got political approval from all sides.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, in the Syria chemical weapon destruction effort, by making it international and housing it under the joint investigative mechanism between the OPCW and the UN, we really internationalized it. And by internationalizing the problem and the destruction and then the verification, we made it sort of a long-term sustainable, I think, event that everyone had transparency into, and there was a certain confidence that this would go forward. Now, realizing, of course, that effort didn't destroy all of Syria's chemical weapons or biological weapons if they were undeclared, but at least internationalizing the destruction of those declared chemical and biological stockpiles, I think, was really helpful. The challenge here is how you go forward in a context in which bombing isn't just threatened, bombing is potentially happening. And now economic sanctions are added to that heightened environment, making it more difficult, I would think, for negotiators. I mean, how do you think adding additional sanctions back when, the JCPOA, of course, itself was not adhered to, or at least was walked away from during Trump 1, do we have sort of a challenge for negotiators to say we will either work under these sanctions or be able to lift these sanctions for the long term when new presidents, new negotiators come into play? I mean, I guess it's a question for either of you, but I worry about the long-term sustainability of any negotiated outcome without international support or without a complete understanding domestically for why this has to be adhered to if we make a deal.
Yeah, absolutely, Mallory. I think it's almost mission impossible, frankly, now for negotiations because there are so many political barriers in place with the President Trump being very, I would say, resistant to sanctions relief for the Iranians, feeling like, the more the better is how I perceive it. And of course, the Iranians objecting to that mightily. But I do take note of several things. First of all, the Iranians have been signaling now at a very high level that they're on top in this conflict, and maybe it's time to end the war now. To me, the underlying message there is, yes, there is economic pressure on us. It's severe enough that we need to begin to find a way out. For the Trump administration, who knows? They are, as we keep repeating, very, very unpredictable, and the president himself is unpredictable and peripatetic. But I do think that reflecting back on the Syrian negotiations and how difficult they were, if you can find individuals inside the Tehran government, inside the administration, maybe they're the ones, some of the ones who had experience with the JCPOA. And so perhaps there is also a reservoir of mutual confidence or confidence that they would be willing to draw upon, however scant it may be. They would have to have blessing from on high, but perhaps it is possible. It is possible, we know, because we were pulling off that Syria chemical weapons operation in the midst of a civil war, when the OPCW inspectors were under fire sometimes when they went into Syria. So it was a very, very difficult time, but we managed to pull it off. So I guess based on that precedent and that experience, I'll say never, but there have to be, first of all, there has to be blessing from on high from all the key leaders. And second, there has to be some reservoir both of expertise available to apply to the task, but also a reservoir of confidence that would enable the experts to engage with their counterparts.
Absolutely. Another interesting point that was raised by James Stevens is this context of issue linkage, right? We've seen in the risk management, arms control arena, either an all or nothing approach, which is some of what we heard from the first Trump administration. One of the problems with the JCPOA and that at that time was the first Trump administration it thought it wasn't expansive enough. It didn't address the proxies. It didn't address missile defense. And then we've heard the U.S. government, negotiate or discuss with the Russian government. Let's continue arms control discussions or strategic stability discussions, even though the rest of our relationship may be going south and we're having problems. Certainly, having any conversations during Putin's war of choice in Ukraine. The issue linkage and sort of all or nothing approach versus pinpointing approach has been a constant challenge for risk mitigation discussions and arms control negotiations. Is it something that can be answered uniformly across the board? Like we take an iterative approach to these problems, we take a piecemeal approach, or we take an all or nothing, or do we really have to look at each individual conflict and each individual challenge and figure out how broadly we can discuss it? Or to your point, Rose, can we engage with Russia despite the fact that the Ukraine war is still proceeding? It's a hard back and forth, but you guys both have such experience in this arena. I don't know if either of you have thoughts on this.
Well, I'll just comment really quickly, and then Andy should pick up. I have a carve-out approach, and it's basically linked to the point I made earlier that when we have an existential threat out there, we do what we can to address it despite all the challenges. And the history of strategic nuclear arms control began at the height of the Cold War, when as I always like to say, Soviet pilots or Soviet air defense people were helping the Viet Cong shoot down American pilots over Hanoi. So, we've been in very rough circumstances before of geopolitical enmity, where nevertheless we've been able to advance on the goal of preventing existential catastrophe from affecting humankind, that is an exchange of nuclear weapons. So we're not looking at an exchange of nuclear weapons, thank God, with the Iranians, but addressing a proliferation risk from their highly enriched uranium, I think, comes into this category of something we ought to be able to create a carve-out to address.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Rose. And that's exactly what President Obama decided to do. He was criticized for not including missiles, for not including support to Iranian proxies in the JCPOA, but he focused on the existential problem, which was preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And that's what that agreement did. It did no more than that. And I think it is the most important issue. When Trump started this war, he declared it was the main reason for going to war. I also think it's unfortunate that the United States has lost so much credibility with these threats to use military force again and then backing off from those threats within hours each time or a day each time. We're like we just don't have credibility. And without that backdrop of potential military force, the Iranians have gained the upper hand. I mean, all they have to do is take pot shots at unprotected civilian oil tankers, one or two, and the insurance markets take care of the rest. And it is truly asymmetric war. And we find ourselves in an extraordinarily weak position today.
Thank you both. And absolutely, I think the famous government phrase, making the perfect the enemy of the good, is such a challenge that we have when we try to encompass all of the problems we face with other governments in risk reduction negotiations, as opposed to taking, as you say, Rose, sort of bite-sized approach or iterative building approaches that can address as you go some of the risks that are again, another famous government phrase, the lowest hanging fruits to tackle. One last thought, because we're reaching the end of this. So first, before I ask this question, huge thank you to you both. But there is a question from the viewers of, what the possible timeline or access points in this administration could be for addressing this, or do we need to wait for a new Congress to really push this point forward, because we're getting caught up in the objectives of an administration that really has, to Andy's point, threatened and then not sort of followed through, or threatened and followed through during negotiations. I mean, is this a moment in which we need a new voice in the leadership to take this forward, or do you think it's possible to do it now? I know that's a hard one to answer, but Andy or Rose, do you have any thoughts on that?
Why don't you go first, Andy, while I think about it?
Well, I don't have a good answer, but the simple answer is we have to keep trying. This is too important. The stakes are too high for us to get bored with it and walk away. I mean, this requires high-level attention because it is an extraordinarily grave national security issue for the United States of America and the world.
Yeah, and again, I'll return to a point I made earlier about this is not a moment for megaphone diplomacy, which is some of what we see with these very high visibility trips going on. President's envoys fly off, they have a meeting, they leave, there are lots of headlines. The president makes a lot of statements, a lot of threats, and the Iranians do as well, and the Israelis chime in. To my mind, this is a moment, at least on this issue, to try to bring the temperature down and to try to you need to have attention to the matter, but in a pragmatic and problem-solving way that is, to my mind, best served by confidential diplomacy. So to have now some other leaders perhaps being willing to start to weigh in, to begin to contact and discuss these matters with the Iranians and with Washington, I think this could be a good moment to do that. Of course, I don't have necessarily a direct phone line to Astana or to Beijing or to Islamabad or any of the other places we've mentioned today, but I do think this is a moment, I think, for quiet, confidential diplomacy, if it is possible. And I want to applaud Andy's idea of getting some experts together even now to think through, even if it's only in a track 2 setting, but maybe it could be a track 1.5 and get some experts from inside the government too, to quietly talk about what may be possible. And when we say, track 2, track 1.5, we're probably starting here in the United States with Americans talking among each other, and then perhaps involving some foreign interlocutors as well.
Yeah, I just want to mention on the 17th of September at 2 o'clock, we're going to have a roundtable co-hosted with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. and the government of Kazakhstan to continue talking about this issue and what role Kazakhstan can play given its incredible moral authority on nuclear nonproliferation issues in moving towards a resolution of this problem.
That's what I'm talking about. So I'm really glad to hear that that's going forward. Thanks, Andy.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for this really interesting discussion. I hope many of the audience is able to tune in on September 17th. And to everyone who joined and asked questions, thank you so much. To Rose and Andy, deepest appreciation for your comments. This has been really interesting. And tune in for more Council on Strategic Risks conversations about ongoing challenges. But we thank everyone for your participation, and really, hopefully we can address this challenge in the near term to prevent greater loss of life or nuclear risk. So thank you both, and thank you all. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Mallory. Thank you.
Thanks, Mallory.